Hey there, my dear children. Hi, my sweet ones. My name is Grandma Mary Wilson. I'm 78 years old. I was born in 1947 here in small-town Ohio, and thank God I'm here today telling this story that completely changed my life. But before I begin, I want to ask a favor from all of you who are listening. If you're finding this story interesting, I'd really love for you to like this video, subscribe to the Grandma's Diary channel to follow more stories like this one, because there's still so much more to tell, and I'd really like to know where you're watching from. Are you at home? At work? Leave it in the comments, because it means so much to me to know that there are real people listening to me. Well, I'm going to start this story that's still very difficult to tell even today, even with all the time that's passed. It all started on a Thursday. You know, one of those ordinary weekdays? Well, Thursday was the day my husband, Frank, would wake up at 3 in the morning. Not every day, no. It was specifically Thursday, always Thursday. And this would happen every month, without fail. I would stay awake, feeling him get up from bed, that sound of the old mattress, that creak that only someone who's lived with a person for 35 years knows. I'd pretend I was sleeping, but my heart would race. You know that chill that runs down a woman's spine? The one you feel when something isn't right? I felt it every time Thursday came around. Frank would get up slowly, very slowly, as if he didn't want to wake anyone. He'd go to the bathroom, I'd hear the water running. Then I'd hear his footsteps going down the stairs of our house, the kitchen door opening to the garage, the car starting, and then he'd leave at 3 in the morning, alone, silently, as if he was keeping a secret that no one was supposed to know, as if he was carrying guilt that was his alone. I stayed like this for a while, pretending I didn't notice anything. But the truth is, I noticed everything. When you live with a man for more than 30 years, you know even the way he breathes. You know the sound of his footsteps, the way he closes the door, the speed at which he drives. And the way a man breathes when he's hiding something is very different from normal. It's much heavier, much more guilty. It's as if his breathing carried all the weight of that secret. The nights became unbearable for me. I'd lie next to him and think, where does he go? Why Thursday specifically? Why at dawn? Why can't it be during the day when we could do something normal? Because if it were during the day, he could take me with him. He could say, Mary, I'm going out for a bit. Want to come along? But Thursday at 3 in the morning wasn't something a husband who wants to take his wife along would do. It was something a man hiding something serious would do, something that only exists in darkness, something like an affair. And I was absolutely certain it was an affair. My Frank was 76 years old at that time. He wasn't that young man I had met back in 1960 when he arrived in town wearing that handsome military uniform that all the girls would look at. You know how it was, right? Back then, a man in uniform was like something out of the movies. He was about 22 years old, straight-backed, with that confident manner of someone who serves his country. I was 19, still a young woman with all my illusions intact. And when he looked at me that day, at the town festival, I felt it was the beginning of a beautiful story. Well, a story I thought was beautiful. But now, so many years later, he was different. All white hair, slightly hunched shoulders, tired. That body I knew so well had changed. His hands trembled a little when he picked things up. His eyes were deeper, more hollow, but that look of his, that look still held secrets, still held guilt, and I began to imagine worse things each day. Was he having an affair at that age? With whom? Where? How could a 76-year-old man with arthritis in his back, with that weariness that age brings, manage to be in love with another woman? My God, we had 3 grown children, we had 5 grandchildren, we had an entire life built over 35 years. We had shared laughter, shared tears, shared cold and warm nights. How could he do this to me? Why would he do this? Jealousy began eating at my heart like acid. Suspicion was worse than any physical pain I'd ever felt. Back pain, headaches, those things pass. But the pain of suspicion is a pain that stays, that lives inside you and never leaves. I'd wake up on other nights, nights that weren't Thursday, and look at him sleeping and feel a rage I'd never felt before. A deep rage. A rage that burned inside me like fire. I'd end up staying awake all night, listening to him breathe, thinking about where he'd gone that Thursday, thinking about who he was with, thinking if there were kisses involved, thinking if there were other things a wife doesn't even want to imagine. My God, how our minds work when we're desperate. We invent stories that hurt even more. I began noticing other things too. Did he come back from the car with his clothes a bit disheveled, or was it just my imagination? He'd arrive with that night smell on his clothes, that smell that Dawn has. I'd even smell the collar of his shirt when he slept. I did that. Seems crazy, doesn't it? A 43-year-old woman discreetly smelling her husband's clothes to try to discover if there's another woman's perfume. But suspicion really does make you go crazy. And the money? Was he spending money on this woman? Was I controlling with the accounts? No, I never was. My Frank worked. I took care of the house and children. The money was his, but I saw the statements, I paid some bills, and there were some things that didn't add up. Cash withdrawals that had no explanation, purchases at stores he'd never mentioned, small things that, when you're suspicious, seem like mountains. Then one day, talking to my friend Mrs. Louise, who was like a sister to me, I completely opened my heart. I was so full of anguish that I couldn't keep it in anymore. We were having coffee, sitting in her kitchen, and I said, "Louise, my husband is going somewhere every Thursday at 3 a.m. It's been months since I noticed this. He leaves silently, comes back an hour or two later, and pretends nothing happened." Mrs. Louise looked at me the way true friends look, with worry on her face, with that certainty that something really isn't right. And she said, "Mary, you need to find out. You deserve to know the truth. No woman deserves to live in this uncertainty." And then I decided to follow him. Seems crazy, doesn't it? A 43-year-old woman waking up at dawn on purpose, leaving home hidden from her own husband, getting in her car just to follow her husband's car through the city. But we do crazy things when we're desperate. We do things we never imagined we'd do when our heart is broken, and suspicion is eating us from the inside like a disease. I thought about it for days before doing it. I thought if it was right. I thought if it was wrong. I thought if it was betrayal on my part to monitor my own husband. But in the end, I needed to know. The uncertainty was killing me. That wasn't living. It was daily agony. The first Thursday, I decided to follow him. I put on dark pajamas so I wouldn't be too visible. I grabbed my purse, left the car keys near my bed. Everything was prepared. When Frank woke up at 3 a.m, as usual, I pretended to be sleeping deeply. I even made sounds like someone sleeping heavily, you know? So he wouldn't suspect. I heard his footsteps, the bathroom, the stairs, the kitchen door, the garage. When I heard his car start, I waited about 5 minutes. Then I got out of bed very slowly, very quietly. I put a jacket over my pajamas, grabbed the keys to my white Beetle, opened the front door very carefully so it wouldn't make noise, and left. My heart was racing too much. I was afraid of being caught. I was afraid of what I was going to discover. I was afraid of everything. The city streets were empty in that way that only dawn can make empty. That frightening emptiness. Very few cars, few lights on in houses. Just the sodium streetlights illuminating the empty, dark streets. It seemed like we were the only ones awake in the world. It was just me and my Frank driving through the dawn in silent pursuit. I followed him from a distance, very afraid he'd see my car. My Beetle was well known in town, everyone recognized it. I tried to keep distance. When he turned left, I'd wait a bit before turning. When he got on a straight avenue, I'd let several cars between us, if there were cars. But that dawn, there was almost no one driving. My heart beat so hard inside my chest that I thought he could hear it from far away. Really? It was that accelerated beating you feel when you're very nervous, very scared. I felt my face burning, even with the dawn cold. My hands trembled when I held the steering wheel. My Frank drove unhurried. He wasn't fleeing in a rush, like someone wanting to hide something with speed. No. He was driving normally, calmly, like someone who knows the way well, like someone who's been doing this for a long time. So long it had become routine. Every curve he took, I took too. Every traffic light he stopped at, I stopped several cars behind, or if there were no cars, I stopped far away. And we continued like this, silently, through the dawn streets, like a macabre dance where only we were dancing. We passed the main street of the city, past the closed market, past the square, past everything I knew. And then he entered a street I knew very well, Martyrs Avenue. My heart began beating differently, because I knew exactly where that street led. And it wasn't to any woman's house, no. It was to a place I didn't expect, even in my worst thoughts, a place that was even scarier than the idea of a common affair. My Frank turned to enter the cemetery. My God in heaven. Cemetery. That place you only visit when you've lost someone, when you're in mourning, when you need to go talk to the dead because there's no one alive left to talk to. And my husband was going there alone every Thursday at 3 a.m. I didn't understand anything. My brain couldn't process that. I parked my Beetle on a side street far away and turned off the engine. I peeked through the car window and saw my Frank getting out of his. He was wearing that brown coat he used for everything. The same coat for years. He grabbed something from the back seat, but it was too dark for me to see exactly what it was. Did it look like a flower? I'm not sure. My Frank walked toward the cemetery gate and entered. I felt a different cold from what dawn brings. A cold that comes from within. The cold of fear, of the unknown, of what we can't control. I sat there in the car, trembling a little, thinking, should I get out? Should I follow him inside? Did I have the courage to do that? Several minutes passed, 10 minutes, 15. I didn't know how much time. Time passed strangely that dawn. It seemed to pass quickly and slowly at the same time. Then I couldn't take it anymore. I opened the car door as quietly as I could and got out. My legs were trembling. I walked toward the cemetery gate. The gate was open. I entered, and there inside, even with all that darkness that only a cemetery at night can have, I could see my Frank. He was far away, very far, walking among the headstones. I followed him, but keeping distance behind trees when there were any, behind the headstones themselves, like a ghost chasing another ghost. A cemetery is too strange a place to be at night. I had never noticed that before. When we visit during the day, with sun, with other people around, it seems like a normal place, a place of remembrance. But at night, alone, it's like being in another world. The headstones seem to come to life. Shadows move, the wind makes strange sounds. My Frank stopped at a certain point. He stood there looking ahead. I got a little closer, but still keeping distance, behind a big tree that was there. And then I saw exactly where he was. He was in front of a headstone. An old headstone? Really old? From when? He raised his hand and touched the headstone. He touched it with that tenderness you only have for very important people, people you've loved very much. And then I saw the flower he had in his hand. It was a red rose, a whole red rose, very beautiful, well cared for. My Frank placed the rose in front of the headstone, and then, even from far away, even in the dark, I heard. I heard because the silence of the cemetery at night amplifies everything. He began to cry. It wasn't discreet crying. It was the crying of someone who can't hold it in anymore, of someone who's carried pain for a long time and lets it all out at once. My heart raced. My God, what was that? Why was my husband crying in front of a headstone? What important person of his had died? What person I didn't know about, because my Frank had never talked much about death with the children. He was a man of few feelings, you know? That generation didn't express much, but there, in that moment, he was expressing pure pain. I got closer, very slowly. He was so concentrated in that crying that he didn't notice me. I managed to read the headstone, managed to see what was written there, And when I read the name, my entire world collapsed. Rosalind Silva Cardoso, 1939 to 1961. That name was a name my husband had mentioned only once in our entire married life. Only once. It was in the 1970s, about 10 years after we had married. He was drinking, something he practically never did. And he said, "Mary, we're lucky to be together. Some people lose the opportunity." That was it. Never spoke about it again. Never again. And then I remembered. I remembered an old conversation with his mother. Mrs. Francis had mentioned once when she was still alive in the 80s. "Frank had a girlfriend before you. Rosalind. Such a beautiful girl. Poor thing. Died young." That was it. His mother had mentioned it in passing, like someone talking about something trivial. My Frank had gotten very quiet when his mother spoke. Very quiet indeed. But I had never asked more about it. I was young, I was in love, I was happy. Why would I want to know about an old girlfriend? That didn't interest me. That was the past, or so I thought. Now there in that cemetery, at 3 a.m, reading that name on the headstone, everything made sense. Everything. The secrets, the tears, the Thursdays, the 35 years we'd had together, everything made sense. Rosalind had died at 22 years old. I did the math quickly in my head. She was born in 1939 and died in 1961. This was before my Frank met me. This was before he married me. This was more than 40 years ago when he started coming here. My Frank gradually stopped crying. He breathed deeply. That body of his, hunched, dejected, seemed to be carrying the weight of the entire world. He stayed there in silence, looking at the headstone. He didn't say anything, didn't do anything, just looked, as if that headstone held all the answers to his life. And then he did something that froze me. He touched the headstone again, this time with both hands. He touched it with that impossible-to-describe tenderness, that tenderness that only exists between two people who loved each other very much. And he whispered something. I couldn't hear properly, but it seemed like he was talking to her, talking to the dead woman, conversing with Rosalind as if she were there. My Frank stayed there for about 20 minutes. 20 minutes in silence, just touching that headstone, sometimes running his hand over the rose he had placed. And during all that time, my heart was racing. I felt like I was having a heart attack, that sensation that the ground was going to disappear from under my feet. Then he left. He turned and walked back toward the cemetery exit. I had to quickly leave from behind that tree and return to the path. My Frank didn't see me. He left the cemetery, got in his car, and drove back home. I stayed there. I stayed there standing, alone in the cemetery, in the middle of that darkness, with that cold, and I approached the headstone. I got close, very close, to read better what was written. Rosalind Silva Cardoso, 1939-1961, beloved by all who knew her. May she rest in peace. And below the main inscription, there was more. There was a phrase that seemed to be a bit worn by time, as if it had been touched many, many times over the years. The phrase said, "Always in the heart of those who knew how to love." My God. In that moment, everything fell. Everything crumbled inside me. My entire marriage had been a lie. It wasn't even a common affair of the type we imagine. It wasn't another living woman. It was a woman who had been dead for more than 40 years. My husband had been visiting this grave every Thursday, religiously, for 35 years of marriage. Every Thursday for 35 years. This meant that when we met in 1960, he was still in love with Rosalind. When we married in 1963, he was still in love. When our first child was born in 1964, he was still in love. When our second child was born in 1967, he was still in love. When the third was born in 1970, he was still in love. When we bought that house we had saved so much for in 1975, he was still in love. When my mother died, when the whole family went through crises, when we took trips, when we shared joys, when we shared sorrows, he was still in love. And every Thursday, while I slept, while the children slept, while the world slept, my husband left home to visit the woman he had truly loved. The woman he never forgot. The woman who, even dead, was more important than me. I fell to my knees in that cemetery. Literally fell. My pajamas already dirty from the dark cemetery ground. And I cried. I cried the way you cry when you discover a truth that breaks everything you believe to be true. How long did I stay there? I don't know. An hour? 2? Time had lost meaning. I only remember that at some point dawn began to lighten a little. The sky began to get a little less black, and I was there alone in the cemetery with that red rose my husband had left, and the absolute certainty that my entire marriage, the one I thought was beautiful, the one I thought was true, had been a lie from beginning to end. I got up. My body hurt. My heart hurt even more. I returned to the car with fragile legs, as if they couldn't carry me. I drove back home. My Frank was already there lying in bed, pretending to sleep, as if that entire dawn had been normal, as if all that crying had been just a dream. I entered the house, closed the door slowly, went up the stairs, entered the bedroom, took off my jacket, lay on the other side of the bed, keeping distance, and there lying down, trembling, I pretended I was waking up when he woke up. I pretended it was a normal morning. I pretended my entire world hadn't collapsed that dawn, but it was never normal again. I didn't sleep that night, nor many others that came after. We say insomnia is when we can't sleep, but this wasn't insomnia. It was despair. It was my body refusing to rest because my brain couldn't stop processing all of that. I lay next to him in the darkness of the room, listening to him breathe. And each breath of his sounded like betrayal. Every movement he made seemed loaded with guilt. I wanted to scream. I wanted to wake him up and demand explanations, but I didn't do anything. I stayed there quietly, letting silence do its work of destruction. When dawn broke, everything seemed different. The light coming through the window no longer illuminated that room like before. That light now revealed a truth I'd had inside the house all night long. My Frank woke up as usual, got up, went to the bathroom, went down to the kitchen. No difference in his behavior. No change. He didn't know that I knew. I made coffee. That coffee I'd been making every day for more than 30 years, always the same way. He drank it the same way he always drank it, with a little sugar, no milk. And we looked at each other that morning, and I did something I'd never done. I searched his face for clues. I looked for signs of who he really was because I didn't recognize that man sitting in front of me. Our 3 children were still sleeping. They were teenagers at that time. They had their lives, their friends, their problems. They didn't notice anything, or maybe they noticed and didn't say anything. Children don't usually talk about these things with their mother. I spent the entire day with that knowledge weighing on my head. I made dinner, cleaned the house, did laundry, did all the things a married woman does every day. But none of that had meaning anymore. Nothing, because every action I took knowing there was a void in the place where my husband's love should have been. In the following days, I began observing him differently, observing with that new knowledge, with that certainty that hurts. I noticed things I should have noticed years ago if I had been able to see. He spent most of his time isolated, reading the newspaper alone, sitting on the porch, looking at nothing. He didn't talk much with me, didn't talk much with the children. He seemed to always be somewhere else, in another time. And Fridays, after that Thursday night, were worse. It seemed like he got intoxicated by something I couldn't name. He'd drink a little, which wasn't his habit. He'd get aggressive. No, not physically. My Frank never raised a hand to me, but there were much crueler ways to hurt. There was indifference. There was disdain. I began gathering courage to confront him. Days passed. A whole week. 2 weeks. I'd breathe deeply every night, thinking, tomorrow I'll talk, tomorrow I'll ask, tomorrow I'll demand the truth. But tomorrow would come, and I couldn't open my mouth. How do you accuse someone you love of being in love with a woman who's been dead for more than 40 years? How do you start a conversation like that? Then one Thursday, while he slept, I did something I was afraid to do. I searched through his things. I looked in drawers, in pockets, in places where men usually keep things they don't want anyone to know about. It seems invasive. It was. But I was desperate. I needed to know more. I needed proof that all of this was real. I found in a drawer of the nightstand, under some old documents, a wooden box, small, delicate, the kind men keep with important things. I opened it carefully, like someone doing something forbidden. Inside were photos, black and white photos, too old, from the 1950s. And in one of them was my Frank, much younger, about 22, 23 years old, next to a young woman. She was beautiful, very beautiful. She had that sweet face, that genuine smile that people had in that era. That face I recognized from the headstone. It was Rosalind. In the photo, my Frank had his arm around her. He had that smile I hadn't seen directed at me in years. Maybe I'd never seen it. That was the smile of someone who was truly in love, of someone who was truly happy. There were more photos, several, Rosalind at different ages, always beautiful, always smiling, always next to him. And in each photo, my Frank seemed to be a different person, a more alive person. There were also letters written by hand with that elegant handwriting people had in that era. I didn't read them all. I couldn't, because after reading the first lines of the first letter, that paper began to blur from my tears. The letter began with, "My love. My love." After 35 years of marriage to me, my Frank had letters with "My love" written to Rosalind. Letters he kept as if they were the greatest treasure he had. I put everything back exactly as it was. I didn't want him to know that I knew. Not yet, because I needed time. I needed to process that. That night I didn't pretend to sleep. I lay awake, waiting. And when he woke up at 3 in the morning, as always, I heard him leave the house. And this time I got up too. I took the wooden box with the photos and letters and sat in the living room alone, reading all of that under the dim lamplight. I read all the letters. Each one was a blow to my chest. Rosalind wrote with a delicacy I'd never had. She talked about her feelings with a poetry I never could. She said things like, "My Frank, you are my eternity." She said, "When I'm with you, I feel that life has meaning." And then, in that same box, there was a yellowed newspaper clipping from 1961. The news was small, but devastating. Young woman dies in bicycle accident. There were details. Rosalind had gone out on her bicycle one weekend, was hit by a car, died on the way to the hospital. She was 22 years old. My Frank was 23 years old when she died. He had just lost the woman of his life, the woman he considered his eternity. And according to that old newspaper that was in my hand, he had been identified as Rosalind Silva Cardoso's fiancé. He had been engaged to her, they were planning to marry, and she died. And then, 3 years later, he met me. 3 years later, he met a young woman at a town festival. A 19-year-old woman who had no idea what he carried inside. A young woman who loved him with all the naivety of youth. A young woman who was destined to be the consolation prize of a man who never got over his true love. When my Frank returned from that cemetery that dawn, I was waiting for him sitting in the living room with all the lights on, with the wooden box in front of me. He stopped when he saw me. His face lost all color. He knew. In that instant, he knew I had discovered everything. We looked at each other in silence, a silence that lasted an eternity. And then I did something I hadn't planned to do. Instead of screaming, instead of complaining, instead of demanding explanations, I began to cry. I cried uncontrollably, that crying that comes from within, that hurts the entire body. And seeing me cry like that, my Frank also fell, literally fell to the floor and began crying too. He cried like someone who could finally stop pretending, like someone who had kept a secret so heavy for so long that it was hurting too much. For the first time in 35 years, he talked about Rosalind with me. He talked about how he had loved her, how he had planned a life with her, how she was his first choice in everything, how he had tried to move on when she died and met me a few years later, how he married me thinking it was the right thing to do, the adult thing to do. But the truth was simple. He had never stopped loving Rosalind, and I had spent 35 years of my life being the second choice of a man who still carried the first one in his heart. 35 years. In that moment, sitting there in the dark living room at dawn, with my husband in tears on my house floor, I felt something I'd never felt before. I felt that my entire life had been a beautiful lie. A lie made with good intentions, perhaps, but a lie nonetheless. My Frank talked for hours. He told stories I'd never heard, stories he'd kept inside him like a poisoned secret. He talked about Rosalind from the beginning, how he met her in 1958, when she was 19 and he was 20. How it was love at first sight, how they planned to marry in 1961, but she died before the wedding happened. He talked about those years after her death, the years when I didn't even exist yet, how he tried to live a normal life, how he tried to forget her, how he drank to forget, how he went out with other women. But none of them was her. None of them filled that void. And then he talked about me, about how he met me in 1960. Yes, in 1960, 1 year before Rosalind died. He already knew me when he was engaged to another woman. That was a discovery that hurt more than everything. He had met me, had talked to me, maybe even had interest in me while he was committed to Rosalind. Rosalind died in 1961, and he waited 2 years, 2 years of mourning, of pain, of trying to process that loss. And then in 1963, when he thought he could live again, he looked for me. I was nearby, I was viable, I was young and beautiful and available, and he married me. But you don't marry someone because that person is viable. You marry because you love. You marry because you see a future. And my Frank had married me knowing he didn't love me like he had loved Rosalind, knowing I would always be second, knowing there was a space in his heart that would be eternally occupied by a dead woman. He talked about the cemetery visits as if they were sacred. He said he started going regularly every Thursday, because Thursday was the day he had proposed to Rosalind. Every Thursday, he went to remember, to keep that memory alive, to keep alive that person who had been his true reason for living. And during all this time, I was at home, sleeping, taking care of children, making dinner, aging, living a life that wasn't really mine, because I was next to a man who was somewhere else, a man who every night when he lay next to me was thinking of another woman. I asked why he had never told me, why he had kept that inside him like cancer. He didn't answer properly. He stayed quiet for a long time, and then he said something that hit me like a punch. He said he was afraid that I would reject him, afraid that I would leave him, afraid of being alone again. So basically, he had chosen to trap me in a lie, to keep me in a lifetime of illusion, because he was afraid of being alone. He had preferred to emotionally betray me every day rather than face that fear. Every day for 35 years. That dawn lasted an eternity, or passed very quickly. Time had lost meaning. At some point, my Frank tried to approach me, tried to hug me, and I pushed him away. I couldn't even stand his touch in that moment. In the following days, the house became different, heavy, as if truth had occupied every corner of that place. I'd pass by him and feel anger, feel contempt, feel pity, and worst of all, I still felt love. Because you don't remove love from a place in your heart just because you discovered that love wasn't reciprocated the way you imagined. The children began to notice. They noticed that things had changed between us. The whole dynamic of the house had changed, but no one asked anything. It was that way families dealt with bad things in that era. You pretend you don't see. You pretend everything is normal, and eventually you believe it is. But it wasn't. Everything wasn't normal. I began seriously thinking about leaving my Frank. I was 43 years old. I was young enough to start a new life, wasn't I? I had some years of life ahead still. Why should I waste those years living a lie? But then I thought about the children who had parents together. In an era when divorce was shameful, in an era when a woman who left her husband was seen as a failure. My children would suffer, would be judged, might even be rejected. And I thought about myself, about who I was without that marriage, because while I was married, I had identity. I was Frank's wife. I was the mother of our children. I was the lady of that house. If I left, who would I be? A woman alone, divorced, without her own income, because I had spent 35 years taking care of the house. In that time, the 1970s, women didn't work if they didn't need to. Women took care of the house. Women took care of children. Women took care of their husbands. And if you left that life, you became a social failure, an anomaly. So I did what many women do when they discover they've been betrayed this way. I stayed, but I stayed different. I stopped smiling the way I used to smile. I stopped interacting with affection. I stopped looking for my Frank in bed. We slept in the same room but in separate corners, like two strangers who shared the same house by circumstance. And I continued observing those Thursdays, because after that confrontation, he went back to going, continued visiting the cemetery, continued leaving flowers, continued having a relationship with a dead woman I couldn't compete with. So, I began doing my own things. After so many years being just the wife, after so much time putting his desires before mine, I began living for myself. I began finding myself in small things. I'd go out with my friends. Mrs. Louise became even more important during that time. We'd go to her house, have coffee, talk about life. No one knew what had happened. No one knew my marriage had collapsed that way. But Louise noticed I had changed, and she respected that. I began reading more. I'd never had time to read. There was always something to do at home. But now, I made time. I'd get books from the library, sit on the porch, and read. Those books took me to places my body couldn't go. They let me be someone who wasn't just a betrayed woman. I began taking better care of myself. I did my hair differently. I bought new clothes. It wasn't to impress anyone. It was for me. It was to remember that I existed beyond that false marriage. My Frank noticed all of that. He noticed I had changed, and he suffered because of it, because he had lost the control he had. While I was there taking care of him, small, quiet, he had control. But now that I had found a way to live that didn't depend on him, he didn't know how to deal. We continued married, continued living under the same roof, continued being perceived as a couple, but we had become two strangers who shared a house and a history. And every Thursday at 3 a.m, I'd hear the garage door opening, and I'd stay awake, knowing exactly where he was, knowing he was there, in that cemetery, visiting the woman he should have buried when she died, but whom he insisted on keeping alive inside him. I could have felt anger, I should have felt anger, and partly I did. But what I felt most strongly was pity. Pity for a man who had spent his entire life living in the past. Pity for someone who couldn't let go. Pity for a life wasted in mourning for someone who had been gone for a long time. And pity for myself. Pity for myself for having allowed this to happen, for having believed my love was enough to fill that void, for having thought I could be sufficient for someone who had chosen a shadow instead of a real person. The years continued passing. The children grew up, grandchildren arrived, we continued living that couple charade. No one knew, no one needed to know. It was our secret, his about that first woman, mine about this entire life that felt like it wasn't really mine. But that secret weighed too much. And every Thursday night I felt that weight descending on my chest like a rock. More years passed, many years. The 1980s came and went, the 1990s too. My Frank aged and I aged along with him. But we aged in silence, in separation, in that type of company that's more solitude than anything else. I continued doing my things. I continued reading, continued going out with Mrs. Louise, continued existing inside that house, but in a way that was just mine. The children married, had their own problems, their own lives. No one noticed that marriage was a facade marriage. My Frank continued visiting the cemetery every Thursday, religiously, as if that were an obligation, a debt he had to pay to Rosalind's ghost. He never talked about it again. After that dawn, we never talked about that subject again. It was as if there were an unspoken agreement between us. He visited the dead woman and I pretended I didn't know. We continued living life. But inside me, something had changed. In the beginning, it was anger. It was a deep hatred that would wake me at night. It was a feeling of having been robbed. Because that's how you feel when you discover you were second choice. You feel robbed. Robbed of a real life, robbed of true love. But gradually, with the passing years, that anger transformed. It didn't disappear, no, but it changed form. It became less sharp, became more like a scar. That type of scar you carry and always remember what happened, but that doesn't hurt the same way anymore. I began understanding my Frank in a way I'd never understood before. I began seeing that he was a victim too. Not in the same way I was, but he was a victim of a loss he'd never processed properly. He was a victim of grief that no one teaches you how to deal with when you're in that era. In the 1950s, you didn't go to therapy, you didn't talk about your feelings, you buried all of that deep down and tried to move forward. And my Frank had tried to move forward. He had married, had children, had worked, had built a life. But that grief was there, throbbing, always present, always asking for attention. And he had chosen to punish me, because in the end, that's what he was doing. Visiting that cemetery every Thursday, he was punishing me for not being Rosalind. He was punishing me for having survived when Rosalind died. He was punishing me for existing in a world where she no longer existed. My Frank was 85 years old when he began getting sick. It was 1995 or 1996, I don't remember exactly. All the years got mixed up in my memory. He had a heart attack. Nothing too serious, the doctors said. But it was a warning. It was life saying he wouldn't be here forever. And something changed after that heart attack. That fear of death makes you reprioritize. My Frank began getting even quieter, more thoughtful. I began noticing he'd spend entire hours sitting on the porch, looking at nothing, as if he were having very important inner conversations. One afternoon, he called me, asked me to sit next to him. We stayed in silence for a long time. I was nervous. I didn't know if I was supposed to say something, if I was supposed to wait for him to talk. But eventually, he began talking. He talked about Rosalind again, but this time it was different. It wasn't that desperate tone from before. It was the tone of someone trying to make peace with the past. He said he visited the cemetery because he felt it was his way of keeping her memory alive, that it was his way of not letting death erase her completely. But he also said he had lost so many years living in that grief. He had stopped really living, had wasted a life with someone who loved him, and had spent all his energy feeling sorry for someone who had already gone. And then, in that moment, sitting on the porch with me, my Frank said something that changed everything. He said he was sorry. Really sorry for having done that to me, for having brought me into his life knowing he couldn't give me what I deserved, for having chosen a ghost instead of choosing the person who was by his side every day. He cried. In that moment, at 85 years old, my Frank cried like a child, and for the first time in many, many years, I hugged him. Not out of romantic love, because that had disappeared long ago, but out of compassion, out of that type of love that arises when you finally manage to understand another person's suffering. After that day, something changed between us. We began talking again, not as husband and wife in love, but as two people who had spent an entire lifetime together and could finally understand each other. I asked if he still visited the cemetery. He said yes, but that now he went with another meaning. It wasn't to live in the past anymore, it was to make peace with that part of his life. It was to thank Rosalind for that love that had transformed him completely and then let her rest in peace once and for all. And he asked if I wanted to go with him once. That question scared me, but I said yes, because I had to make peace too. I had to face that woman, that ghost, that had haunted my marriage for 35 years. We went on a Thursday night, not at 3 a.m. like before. It was a normal night. We went by car, both of us in silence. We arrived at the cemetery, entered, and walked to that headstone. Rosalind Silva Cardoso, 1939 to 1961. That name I had read 1,000 times in my mind. That name that had occupied so much space in my heart, despite the person who carried it being dead. My Frank left flowers, a red rose, as always, but this time he turned to me and apologized. Sincere apologies, apologies that came from a deep place. He said he had brought a good woman to compete with a ghost, that it had been unfair, that it had been cruel, even without intention, that he had stolen years of my happiness because he couldn't let Rosalind go. And I, in that cemetery, in front of that headstone, forgave him. Not because it was easy, forgiving is never easy, but because I had to let that go too, because carrying that resentment was like carrying a stone in my chest. And I was tired of carrying. I told him I understood, that I understood you don't choose who you love, that I understood grief is something that never completely leaves you, that I understood he had done the best he could with what he had in that moment, but that I had learned something important during all that life. I had learned that I deserved more, that every woman deserved more, deserved to be first choice, deserved to be truly loved, deserved to have a partner who saw her and chose her every day. And that even though I had lost that with my Frank, I wasn't going to waste more time crying about it, because I still had life to live. I still had years ahead. I still had people who loved me. I had my children. I had my grandchildren. I had Mrs. Louise. I had myself. After that night, my Frank stopped visiting the cemetery. Not completely, but he didn't go every Thursday anymore. He'd go from time to time, but without that weight of guilt, without that despair. He had let Rosalind rest in peace once and for all. And I also let that anger rest, because I realized that anger was toward him, but it was also toward myself. It was anger for having accepted being second choice. It was anger for not having had the courage to leave when I had the chance. It was anger for having let that fear paralyze me. More years passed, my Frank aged more. And in the end, when he was already very sick, in his last days, we'd talk, and he'd tell me he felt he had wasted precious time living in the past, that if he could go back, he'd do differently, that he'd choose me for real, not as second choice, but as a conscious choice, as someone who understood that Rosalind had her story, but that life continued, and that life continued for him too, that he had to live the life he had, not the life he'd lost. But you can't go back, you can only move forward. And that's what I did. I lost my Frank at 92 years old, and when he died, I cried. But it wasn't the crying of someone who had lost the great love of her life. It was the crying of someone who had spent an entire lifetime with a person, who had shared so many things, who even though that love wasn't perfect, it was still love. And after the funeral, after everything calmed down, I began a new life. At 70 years old, I began a new life. I traveled, visited places I always wanted to visit, read books I always wanted to read. I spent time with my children, my grandchildren. I lived because that's what I learned. I learned that we're not only victims of what others do to us. We're also victims of our own choices, of the things we allow to happen, of the way we allow ourselves to be treated. I could have left that marriage. I could have said no. I could have chosen to be happy, even if it meant being alone, but I didn't. And I spent 35 years living a life that wasn't really mine. But afterward, I learned that I still had time, that it wasn't too late to start again, that it wasn't too late to love yourself, that it wasn't too late to really live. And that's the lesson I wanted to leave for you, for whoever is listening to me right now. Don't wait 35 years to discover that you're more important than any relationship. Don't wait for extreme pain to learn that you deserve genuine love. Don't wait to get old to start living, because life passes quickly, much faster than we think it will pass. So I want to ask a special favor of you who made it this far, who listened to this entire story. If you haven't liked this video yet, like it now. If you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, subscribe. Because these stories I have to tell only reach you if you're part of this community here on the Grandma's Diary channel. And I also want to know, you who are listening to me until now, leave a comment. Tell me how you got here. Tell me a bit of your story. Because I like knowing there are real people on the other side, listening, feeling, understanding. You are very important to me. Thank you for listening until the end. Thank you for crying with me. Thank you for understanding that we're not weak for having made mistakes. We're brave for having learned. And I'm grateful to be able to share this with you.